Okay, so there's no one way to approach really any of this, but this is sort of a quick way of approaching color keys or even, full moment paintings or story beats. And there's no one way to do it, but you'll see I'm starting out with the layout. It's in there as the main scan. Now I've added a matte, a black matte, because that's how we view things in the theater. So most often you were presenting and creating in that context. So I paint bucketed my general environment gray so that I can see the matte. Now here I'm, making it a little wider on the left, and if you like, you can drag your reference into there or your, a color key if you're in fact doing the finish and you've already done a value study or a color key. Okay, now with my students, they generally do value studies to accomplish staging and a number of other things in advance. But assuming you have some, value experience under your belt and you want to just go at it, this is what I recommend. So I've multiplied that layout and, I've duplicated the layout and created a multiplied layer from it, which I've dragged to the top. Now you'll see I am creating a paint layer. You can label them however you want, but I'm labeling it paint for now. And I do recommend, merging your layers whenever possible, managing them once you've committed to something. I know a lot of my students have a million adjustment layers and try a million different things, and that's awesome. But once you've committed, go ahead and merge it. So I'm a big fan personally of labeling, layers and then creating groups out of layers and labeling the folders. I often have to deliver my paintings to a client who has to understand my process or may even be working back into the painting later. So it's a good habit to get into. Okay, so what I've done is, just like a normal traditional painting, I've toned the canvas. I've given it basically a color that won't be too distracting, but it's related to the color palette I have in mind. So it's keyed off of cyan, but the tone that I used won't be deceiving in its saturation because, as you know, everything you lay down on top of a ground like that will be affected by it, and your perception of it will be affected by it. So it's a sort of non-obtrusive tone just to get rid of the glare of the white canvas, okay? And so now I've created, I can't see under there, but I think I've created another layer which I'm calling BG, background or sky. And I'm just putting the gradation that I think is a good starting point. It's going to be an overcast scenario here, by the way. So, so I'm hoping for somewhat stylized color. So just a quick gradation thrown in there. And I'm doing it on the backmost layer, BG. Okay, now I'm going to go in and select subsequent layers from it. And I don't worry too much about my edge control or, none of this at this point is really about brushwork or rendering or level of rendering or any of that. We're just really trying to block in for the moment and make some, major decisions about the, again, value structure and the color palette. So I've created the mid-ground level, which I've labeled actually mid-ground, I believe, and now I've gone back and I'm selecting what's behind it. So for the record, it doesn't really matter, but I have a bit of a blur on my selection tool. I go back and forth between the lasso selection tool and the actual, I forget what you call it, but the hanger, the one that looks like a hanger. And anyway, I just make crude, rough selections that are a bit blurry, and then later, of course, when I'm manipulating the paint and modeling and rendering and coming up with my edge control, I can certainly erode those edges or carve into them or go beyond them if I like, but at least it's a nice starting point and I can quickly adjust levels. Okay, and once you create these subsequent levels and you have them on their own layer, you can of course lock them and then you don't have to worry about the edges. If you're familiar with locking layers, even if it's semi-transparent in a given area, you will not be able to add any density to that. It'll just accept the color at the degree of opacity that you've assigned to a given area, if that makes sense. Okay, so now I'm just sort of painting directly into each layer, and yes, they're locked, so the edges remain exactly as I intended them. And I won't explain too much, but I'm just obviously trying to warm up the foreground to set it off from the rest, and I tend to use lighting to affect my temperature whenever possible. So I'm a filmmaker. I think of it as sort of wheeling in a fill light with a gel on it, and it's a little dramatic in the foreground, but I'll start modeling and rendering and mellowing some of that out, and I think the eye will accept some of that warmth as if, I don't know, a porch light in the foreground is sort of affecting it. Obviously, I've gone back into the BG level, and I'm just starting to create a feeling in the sky. Like I said, it's supposed to be sort of brooding and overcast, but I'm creating the logic a little bit to the palette. So obviously the cyan gradation that represents the sky minus the clouds is showing through in the negative spaces where the clouds are thinnest. So I've sort of kept up that logic, and then as I add density, I'm desaturating because it's blocking the light, but it's pretty obligatory to then shift the hue. It doesn't really matter which direction, but whenever, as a hint, whenever you shift the value of a color, especially if you're representing lighting of any kind, it's just sort of obligatory to shift the hue, and the eye accepts it a little better. It easily gets muddy if you just simply darken a tint, or darken a color, and don't shift it on the color wheel. Hope that makes sense. So yeah, I'm just going in and sort of manipulating that sky, and I'm thinking about staging now. So it's sort of vignetted on the edges no matter what. The cyan loses its influence near the edges, but more importantly, less contrast on the edges to keep the eye away, and slightly darker. So I've created a nice staging area with the cyan that'll be right behind that Victorian house. I'm sorry I'm talking so fast, but obviously I speeded up the demo, and now I'm doing the voiceover to it. Okay, so you can pretty much tell I'm just manipulating the values, so there's a real strong hot spot in the center. There will be no question where to look, and I think a nice focal point is always a good objective. Okay, so I'm just sort of manipulating the values. Now I'm adding some color accents in the rooftops, and just minor detail that won't sort of yet influence the main value structure. Just creating some hue shifts mainly, and subtle value shifts. Okay, so this is meant to be, by the way, just sort of a sea of suburban rooftops. Yes, I know it looks exotic. It's New Zealand. So for New Zealand, this is pretty mundane. And then, of course, it's supposed to be this Victorian that was transplanted in the neighborhood and sticks out like a sore thumb, towering above the rest. Okay, so now obviously I need to create a quick block-in for that Victorian house, and I'll again be locking it and sort of laying in the light and shadow on the main basic planes. So I sped this up really fast to like 20 times because I don't want to bore you with my selection making. But I, these days, just make really crude selections, if that makes sense. And if there's a little bit of a blur on your brush, you don't have to be too accurate. I mean, a little blur on your selection tool. So I basically selected it. I copy from a subsequent layer just to save time, and then I manipulate my values in color. And yeah, you'll notice I've really organized my layers and labeled them as I've proceeded. I really haven't created too many adjustment layers that'll confuse me later. All right then, so now that would be called a dark halo, though the colors got kind of screwed up there. You know, you're creating light and dark halos all the time, unless you want mystery and you want sort of two layers to merge. You're often trying to create atmospheric perspective and create a sense of depth. So light and dark halos are really what matter. It's the edge of the middle ground, foreground, background that matters in terms of separating it from the subsequent layers and creating the illusion of depth. Okay, so now I'm just making a selection for the harsh direct light that's going to come in and affect that Victorian. So like Ansel Adams, I'm thinking, there's a break in the clouds somewhere and warm light is flooding in, and it's meant to be very foreign to this overcast scenario. If you look at Ansel Adams' entire career, you'll see much of it is Yosemite, and you'll often see Half Dome with this, again, very novel shaft of light that, they say if you paint it, people won't believe it. Well, he made a whole career out of that. So that's, what this is meant to be, a sort of dramatic, almost angelic sort of staging of this. I don't know what I'm doing there. I think I'm just going back and, creating the dark halos on that backmost level so that it registers against the sky. And then, of course, this is meant to be a volcano near Wellington, New Zealand. And I've stylized it, of course, but we're going to draw attention to it as well for story purposes by hitting it with that same warm light. And now, of course, there's a little logic here. I'm thinking these are the areas that are elevated enough to receive the light. It's called alpine light when it's sort of raking through the atmosphere at a certain level and it's at a low angle. You'll get a lot of long cast shadows and select taller things that might be receiving the light. Now I think I'm manipulating in the sky to make the warm-cool relationship more dramatic and to just make sure that cyan exists behind the manor but nowhere else. Okay, more to come. All right, so I'm just manipulating the clouds a little bit. I decided I actually wanted them a little more stylized, a little more child-centric and simple in their shape orientation. So painting into those, and once you've sort of laid in, as you know, I have the cyan negative space of the sky sort of bleeding through the clouds in their thinnest areas, and then where there's density, it shifts a little more neutral and a little more towards the red-blue. So once that sort of has been laid in, I'm able to just pick my colors directly from what's underneath, and the color is very clean. It was systematic and sort of scientific to begin with, but then once it's opaque and it's there, just using the eyedropper is a real blessing. Okay, so now I'm just going into the foreground. Like I said, I've made crude selections and they are quite soft. In other words, I put a blur on the selection tool for a reason, because then I can go in and manipulate and sort of create what I call the edge control that correlates with focal distance on a camera. So in other words, I'm picking the middle ground as the focal distance, and everything in that range, because that's where the story is being told, will be crisp and in focus. Now everything beyond that is a little bit soft already, and here I'm using sort of painterly brush strokes to diffuse the foreground. So there's a lot of ways to throw one of your levels or planes, call them what you want, out of focus. Of course, a Gaussian blur is very synthetic, and it can look foreign to the style of the painting. In fact, in Lion King, we would often paint, what we thought were beautiful backgrounds, of course, with a lot of edge control. And then you'd go into dailies, and they, especially on Lion King, put a Gaussian blur on it for the rack focus, for example, and you don't even recognize your own background. So Tarzan was actually an attempt to put the control back in the hands of the background painters in terms of lost and found and focal distance and edge control. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I'm basically just blurring all the foreground elements with a nice painterly brushstroke. Okay, now I'm back on the midground, just sort of adding more rooftops. What I'm trying to do in the midground is not spell everything out. I want to just indicate and not draw too much attention to that area. And so I kind of found my way as I went. You'll see I'm creating side planes that catch a little bit of the light. There's a little trick if you want to graphically pull a corner forward, whether it jives with your light logic or not. You can see it's a real great way just on a graphic level to pull that corner forward and create a little bit of depth. So again, I'm finding ways of abstracting the information without having to add every little molding and every window and every shutter. Okay, so you'll see by the time we hit the end, I've basically just dealt with, local colors of rooftops being significantly darker than the body of the house itself, and then I'm doing this trick of just kind of pulling the corners forward by catching a little bit of the ambient light from the left-hand side. Okay, and I do want a generic feeling to the suburbs so that the house feels even more unique. So I very intentionally didn't vary their hues or, hue value or saturation of the rooftops, nor the sides. The walls themselves. So I'm wanting it to look like rather generic, homogeneous cubes, albeit, like I said, in New Zealand, everything has a little more character than here anyway. But for New Zealand, this is meant to be rather repetitious and homogeneous. And again, sort of, I'm thinking white walls, almost like a Tudor style with white walls and darker roofs, but not too much detail, like I said, on the balconies or the shutters or even moldings. There I'm, finding, again, different ways of abstracting and separating things. So right there on the bottom, you see I've got the cyan light sort of bleeding behind another level. So there's a dark halo on the closer buildings and then a light halo behind them to separate them. And again, just going back into the rooftops, adding slivers where necessary to show the far side of the roof. Now, I thought a great way to abstract this area and add to the mood of the piece, since it's so overcast and almost rainy looking, I thought I'd turn some lights on. So again, this is a method I didn't really explain it too well before, but just to save time, I often make selections as I am doing here for the windows, and then I use the copy method to create a new layer. So I just copy directly from this existing layer. And in this case, I know I want to warm up those windows and give them a nice, there we go, orange tint. It's sort of inviting and comforting in a way. So sorry, I have a cold. So I just copied directly from the existing layer. I kept that normal layer, meaning opaque, and I found the right hue, value, and saturation that I wanted. And then for the hotspot in the center, as you can see, there's a bit of a glow. That's a color dodge layer. So I tricked it a little more green so that it's hard to explain, but you've got to sort of experiment with your color dodge layers and find out how the hue, value, and saturation you've chosen affects what's underneath. So in this case, it turned out the windows themselves were quite red, and then shifting the color dodge layer toward the green actually resulted in a yellow. Okay, so I'm doing the same thing on the left-hand side. I'm creating a bunch of windows, and then I'll merge the two layers together. Don't want to go into too much detail, but again, you'll see I kept the normal layers and the color dodge layers independent, and then I created a new group from layers. If you're not in the habit of doing that, I would look into it. If you have a significant adjustment you've done, it's great to group it in a folder and then label the folder. And you can turn the folder on and off, and then all the layers inside of it will turn on and off as well. So you can sort of view the result. You can sort of remain non-committal, if that makes sense. And then once you're ready, you can merge the group or sort of merge that folder with the subsequent layers underneath. Okay, so now I'm just adding a little saturation. I wanted that, before I get into any detail, I wanted the light. I have a single layer for the warm light on that entire manor. And I just wanted a little more of a little more form in the turret there. So you'll see I basically just added some midtones and some darker, more saturated values to that. Now I want to hit that tower with some light, so same thing. I just used the selection tool, created a nice graphic shape, copied from what was underneath, and locked it. And now you'll see I'm painting directly into the locked layer opaquely. Great way to do it. Now, same thing here. I want to pull that corner forward. So you're going to see, yeah, that graphic trick of putting the lighter values right there in the corner to pull it forward. Okay, I think next I'm sort of bringing out a little more volume. Not yet, but I will be bringing out a little more volume in the turret itself, because I know it's going to be compromised when I add those teardrop-shaped, or I guess paisley-shaped markings on it. A little more volume, just modeling and rendering the volume of that spire, and then put a highlight on it. And often the highlight will look quite foreign until you sort of prep it. A lot of artists call it prepping the highlight, making sure that there's a bit of a logic to what's underneath your highlight, so it doesn't just sit on top. Okay, and here I'm rounding out, like I said, the selections were crude, so now I'm creating a slightly more elegant gradual curve to the turret. I'm creating a darker core shadow on it with the bounce light that might naturally occur on the bottom side that's not receiving the ambient cyan light from the clouds. And in fact, I made it a bit dramatic on the bottom there because I want it to look like the direct light that's hitting the other tower is bouncing back into it. And now you can see on the top, I am creating that cyan ambiance that's raking down from the sky and affecting that turret. And you can probably tell I wanted the whole turret to look a bit reflective. So since I put a highlight in the lit area, you'll notice in the ambient blue on the shadow side, I also created a hot spot. I shouldn't use the word hot, sorry, a highlight. Okay, now I've selected a portion of that turret and just copied it like I've done many, many times during this demo. Raised the value of it, and then sometimes I take that copied layer, I copy it a second time, and create a color layer out of it immediately, so I can have, the value structure underneath, and then I can manipulate the colors independently on top. So just working into the lighter part of the turret, creating the logical form. Part of that wider molding conforms to the turret or the tower itself, and then part of it, as you can tell, starts to conform or wrap around the upper bulbous part of the turret. So I'm just creating that logic, that definition. And now a real quick way, I wanted to add the filigree to the underside on the top portion. So here I just created a nice stroke, copied it, and I'm using skew and warp and any of the transform tools that I can to just quickly get it to feel right. And then I merge them as I go, copied that, flopped it, and I kind of liked the idea of reversing my line work light over dark, just for a slightly more stylized, cartoony look, and marrying them together with that final hand-done loop. Okay, so now here, you may not be able to tell because the cursor is quite invisible in these demos, but I'm actually using paths because I wanted it rather crisp and just a real quick way and to get elegant, fluid curves that are gradual and logical. So I used curves to do that, and then I filled it. I filled the shape. Turned down the opacity because I wanted the graininess from underneath and the value structure from underneath. And now I'm again using warp and any transform tool I need to manipulate. I'm just trying to save time, obviously, to manipulate the teardrop shape and get it to conform to the underlying form. Okay, and then I merge those two together, and now I'm just by hand because that would have been too narrow to manipulate properly. So I'm just by hand creating the one that's right there on the edge that's more condensed as the form turns. Then I take that, and basically, since we're looking straight onto that thing, I'm going to copy it, flop it, just like I did with the filigree, and use that as a starting point. Then I can lock it, paint directly into it, and get the logical warm-cool relationship that I want between light and shadow. I'm going back and forth between using the color function on the brush and painting directly with the normal function. Just going back and forth, and as long as the layer is locked, it should work out. So I'm not going to merge the patterning on that quite yet to the turret.